My name's David Karoly and I'm a professor here at the University of Melbourne, and I'm involved in teaching this Coursera subject, an introduction to climate change, because I'm a climate scientist and have been looking at understanding climate variability and climate change for more than 3 decades using observational data and theories and climate model simulations. This course covers a whole range of topics related to climate change, including the impacts of climate change, including understanding the science of climate change, but also looking at the way that climate variability and climate change impact societies. And we're going to start off in this subject looking at some of those impacts on society, looking at the societal responses to climate change and the impacts on society. Then we'll have a series of lectures on the science of climate change. I'll be involved in teaching many of those subjects on climate variability, climate change. What role natural variability, what is the role and the mechanisms that cause observed climate change over the last 100 years, how the climate has changed over the last 1,000 years and longer. But in particular, we'll be looking at how energy use has changed the composition of our atmosphere, and now how we expect climate to change over the next 100 years. We'll be addressing the question, how much has human activity influenced the climate in the last 100 years, and what's likely to happen in the next 100 years? The conclusions of all major scientific academies, the conclusions of the vast majority of scientists, is that human activity, burning fossil fuels and land clearing, has been the main cause of climate change over the last 50 and last 100 years at global scales. So if that's the case, then what can we do about climate change? What do we need to do in terms of society, our industrial activity, our economy, to change from using fossil fuels as our energy sources and maybe to change to using alternative energy sources, to think about the ways that we can restructure our economy? And that's going to be addressed in the lectures on the economic aspects of climate change. But actually, one of the fundamental issues is really how sustainable is our modern society? We live on Earth. We only have one planet with finite resources. And there's lots of discussion about climate change being a scientific problem. No, actually, climate change is a problem to do with people. It's the way we use energy, the way we use our resources. And when we look at our planet from space, we can now see the human impact on our planet just looking from space. And in particular, we can see the impact of lights. And lights are really an indication of the use of electricity, which is fundamental. It's driving our society. And not only is it driving our society from burning fossil fuels to generate electricity, this energy use is fundamental to the cause of the problem, and that's increasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. When we look at what a number of major political leaders have said about climate change, there are a range of different perspectives. In particular, when we look at climate change, Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General of the United Nations, has said that climate change threatens development that has occurred in particularly developing countries over the last 3 decades. There's been major improvements in many developing countries. Improvements in food supply, improvements in reductions in poverty amongst poorer people all around the world. But climate change threatens that. And this is really an aspect of the north-south divide, where in fact developed countries have primarily contributed to the problem, but the impacts of climate change will mainly affect the poorer people and poorer countries. Barack Obama, 2 years ago in his inauguration speech, says that climate change is an intergenerational issue. It affects younger people and future generations, and he's identified climate change from this perspective of the long-term impacts of the climate on current and on future generations. And then finally, Kevin Rudd was candidate for Prime Minister for Australia in an election campaign in 2007, and he said that climate change is the greatest moral, economic and social challenge of our time. And he won that election, became Prime Minister. But in fact, climate change has been a political challenge in Australia and in many other countries, because Kevin Rudd lost the Prime Ministership in Australia because he failed to act on climate change. And in fact, 3 Prime Ministers and 3 leaders of the opposition have either lost their leadership or have it greatly affected by their failure to act or because they acted on climate change. It is a major issue. And in fact, there's lots of discussion in the media, in business circles, in fact in the community, as to whether climate change is really the greatest moral and economic threat. In fact, lots of people have suggested that maybe the scientific threat associated with climate change has been exaggerated. We'll discuss that in this subject. When we look at it, the way that different people think about climate change, we can see that the different perspectives of climate change can be illustrated by a couple of slides. When we look at the temperature variations over the last 40 years in global average temperatures, we see that temperatures have increased. But actually there's a lot of variability. And when we look at different periods, like the last 10 years, some people, so-called climate change skeptics, say that there's been no warming. But there's also many other decadal periods, like the period in the 1970s when you could say there was no warming, or the period in the 1980s where there's no warming. But in each case, these periods of no warming are stepped warmer than the previous decade. And in fact, when we look at each decade over the last 4 decades has been warmer than the previous decade and warmer than all decades in the 20th century. So it's actually better to look at the whole record and to show that, yes, we know there's lots of natural variability in the climate system, but there's been a pronounced warming. And we'll assess in this course what is the best explanation of that warming. As I said, there's been a range of scientific assessments of climate change. We're going to look at that in this course. We're going to look at the social impacts, the economic impacts, and the way that we can respond. And an excellent summary has been put together by a group established by the Australian government that reported in 2011. They talked about the critical decade. This decade is critical in the world responding to climate change. And their conclusions were that, in fact, the scientific understanding of climate change has improved. There's no doubt that the climate system, that the Earth is warming, the climate is warming, and that the evidence for that is overwhelming. And also that the human cause for this observed warming over the last 100 years is beyond any reasonable doubt. In fact, there are already impacts, economic impacts, social impacts, agricultural impacts, impacts on biodiversity that can be seen around the world from climate change. The most difficult part is knowing what options there are in terms of responding to climate change, either to adapt to the hotter conditions or to respond by removing the causes. And it's critically important. This subject will address the responses to climate change, the causes to climate change, and will really provide an important background to you. First of all, better understanding what is happening with climate change and what you as individuals can do. So please continue to participate and engage in this subject. We look forward to your participation, and I'm sure you will find that you have a much better understanding not only of climate change but its responses and how you can respond to climate change if you remain in this subject for the next weeks. Thank you.